Hello. I don't see any new participant at this stage, but I think we're going to be joined very soon. I can see that the recording has started, so this is um, just our presentation tonight on hand hygiene. Um, just wait a few minutes for people to join. Hi, and welcome to the ESRC Festival today. I am your host. My name is Dr. Marie Wagner Miller. I'm a lecturer in environmental health, and I have done some amount of work over the last few years on hand hygiene. And today I really wanted to uh, deliver this seminar to discuss how hand hygiene could be a very effective intervention um, to prevent the transmission of communicable diseases, and how communicable diseases are likely to increase as a result of climate change. So hand washing will become a really important way to stop communicable diseases that could be a result of climate change. So um, in the discussion today, we're going to cover a range of issues. So first, I'm going to talk about the links between climate change and epidemics. I'm also going to discuss hand hygiene's role in reducing the spread of epidemics. I'll talk briefly about effective hand hygiene, but really I have an interesting a demonstration. I have done some of the work there, filmed myself on doing hand hygiene in an effective way and hand hygiene in maybe not such an effective way. So you'll get to see that video there. And I'm also briefly towards the end going to talk about different interventions, social interventions that can be put in place to really try to improve compliance when it comes to hand hygiene. So we'll start with climate change and global warming. I think it is pretty well known. It's been really popular in the media recently with COP26, and the climate change is an unequivocal phenomenon today and very well evidenced. Global warming is one of the component of climate change. And it induces considerable impact on human health. There are other impacts of climate change, but the one aspect that I will be tying in today is really global warming. So the effect of global warming on human health is mainly divided into two categories. The first one is those direct impact on illness or ill health, like a heat shock or increased mortality in the population with other diseases. And there's also indirect effect on and that could be other diseases such as infectious diseases and allergies. So I'll go into the link between climate and epidemics in a little bit more detail here. This is a well-established link. Actually, humans have known that there is a climatic parameter of epidemic for a long, long time. They actually understood the link between climate and infections much before they actually understood about infectious agent. The discovery of infectious agent is quite late in human history and quite close to us in the 19th century with the discovery of the microscope, really, and that's where it allows to see things that were not visible to the eye. And also some of the mechanics of epidemics was understood before. It really is where we understood germ theory or evolved germ theory there. But way back in the Romans or even in Southeast Asia, centuries ago, they understood that there were conditions that meant that diseases were more prevalent in the population. So, for example, the Romans retreated to hill resorts to avoid the summer malaria. Malaria is typical to swampy areas, so they would move to those other type of area. We also have evidence that actually they understood that malaria, because it's a vector borne by an insect, and I'll mention that later on, tended to be associated with swampy area. They tended to build their cities far away from swamp and swamps places. In Southeast Asia, they actually learned very, very quickly that using curried food, strongly curried food, had an impact on the infectious agent in the food and were less likely to cause diarrhea. So they knew that the strong curry flavor will then have a protective effect on the food that they ate. So that was really related to the type of food that they ate in the summer to avoid spoilage. So infectious disease are caused by infectious agents. There are 5 different types of infectious agents. We have virus and bacteria, which will be the ones that we are most familiar with. I mean, in the UK, most of the diseases that we contract, communicable disease that we contract, are either from viruses or bacteria. Sometimes it could be fungus infection. They are not as common, but you can think of athlete's foot, for example. That's a fungus, for example, and you will need a fungicide for that. And then we have protozoal parasites and multicellular parasites. They're often just grouped into the same parasite category. Now, these are not as common in the UK, but you would hear more of tapeworm and things like that in other countries. You could probably tell by my accent. I'm from France originally, and yeah, we would consume more raw food, raw meat particularly. And yeah, I think in my family, probably every person have experienced at some stage tapeworm because of the contamination in food, like in rare meats or raw meats, like beef tartare, for example. So that is less common in the UK, but it is still out there. Okay, so there are those 5, or if you want to think about 4 mode of transmission, parasite being grouped into the one. And disease transmit also in many different ways. So these infectious agents, they can be, or those infectious disease can be specific to humans. So that means that they really exist in the human population, and those are called anthroposes, and you can see that there on the first type of diseases. We could also contract disease that are transmitted from animals to humans. They suspect that that's the causal link to COVID-19 as well, and that those type of diseases are called zoonoses. But you have other examples, like the typical example is rabies, but bird flu also would be another example. So that's when we're in contact with an animal, we can directly catch their disease. It's quite when we think about diseases, actually it's quite rare. Zoonoses are quite rare compared to anthroposes. Most of the disease that we have are from our contact, human to human, rather than human to animals. There's a few, fortunately, only a few diseases that are transmitted from animals. Another thing that needs to be talked about when we talk about transmission is vectors. So sometimes we catch diseases from the direct contact. So for example, if my husband catch COVID-19, he comes home, and then in the home, in my contact with him, then I contract COVID-19. So those are contact to contact, direct contact. You could also catch, for example, if you get bitten by a dog, a rabid dog, again, probably on the continent, and the UK is very, very rare as well, then you can contract the disease from direct contact. But most diseases, a lot of diseases, are contracted by what we call either a vector or a vehicle. So if somebody at the start of COVID-19, actually, we did quite a lot of that. We thought the virus could survive for quite some time. Actually, there is evidence that it can survive for quite some time on surfaces. So if you are going to the supermarket and picking up a product, and a person that was that had COVID-19, had quite a high viral load, coughed on that product, that the virus would then be in contact with the product, you're picking up that product, and then you're contracting disease. So that's through a vector. I mean, a contact through surfaces is one. Surfaces do not tend to be very conducive of disease, of viruses and bacteria. There needs to be certain characteristics for those to survive on surfaces. So I mean, they can survive just quite some time. Sometimes they're dormant. So it's a bit more complex, and I'm not going into all these complexities. But a lot of diseases are also carried by insects, for example. The typical example is malaria. Malaria being you tend to contract it if the mosquito bites you. The mosquito isn't unwell. The mosquito just carries. So he has probably bitten somebody that has malaria. Then that contaminated blood, then it gets injected in your bloodstream as well whenever the mosquito comes and bites you as well. So that's vector borne, or tick, for example, is vector borne as well. So there are a number of vectors of vehicles. And the two main ones responsible for a lot of disease worldwide is foodborne and waterborne. So diseases that are in the water, people either drinking it or using it to sanitize their hands or wash their hands, or so if there's unsanitary water, that can be a big source of diseases, specifically diarrheal diseases. And food can also be the vector of a lot of infectious disease as well. So it's important that we understand the interactions between, the host, the person that has the disease, or the animal that has the disease, then the vector, the different things that can carry the disease, and the different transmission path, and all of these things then are influenced by the climate. So vectors, infectious agents, and the host each survive and reproduce within a range of optimal climatic conditions. The temperatures and precipitations are most important. For example, for bacteria, moisture and temperature are two of the main characteristics in which either bacteria will grow or they will die. And in fact, we use that a lot in the food, and you do it every day. When you cook food, you increase the temperature, and increasing that temperature automatically kills pathogenic bacteria in food. I mean, if you reach a certain temperature. Also, we do that by refrigerating. We refrigerate foods so they don't spoil, and part of that is a bacterial spoilage. So you can clearly see how bacteria are very sensitive to temperatures. They're also very sensitive to moisture, so they don't. This is also why we would eat a lot of. We can preserve food for a long period of time if they're dried. So dried food, like powdered food, can keep for a long period of time because there's no spoilage, for example. There are other characteristics like sea level elevations, wind, daylight, that also play a part in transmissions, because they also play a part in the vectors, for example. So the example I gave you here, rainfall can influence the transport and dissemination of infectious agents, while the temperature will affect their growth and survival. So just to really simplify the characteristics in which climate change will really increase or the incidences of infectious disease. Climate change leads to global warming, higher temperature. It also leads to a change in rainfall. So it's changes in the pattern of the rainfall, maybe less, so leading to drought, or more in areas that weren't used to that, leading to floods. It leads to extreme weather events like storms and extreme floods. It also means that there's a warming of the sea, and if there's warming of the sea, there's more likelihood for pathogenic bacteria that lives in seawater. They're not as common, but we will see that there are infectious agent, more infectious disease now due to the warming of the seas and change of the sea level. So these are just impact of climate change. And these will affect the following factors: the contamination of water and food by infectious agent. Also, the change of sea levels, the extreme weather events, the change in rainfalls is gonna lead to some animal displacement and human displacement. And the movement of animals and the movement of humans often lead to increase infectious diseases. It also will increase the number and the activity of the vectors. For example, insects. If you have a warmer climate and a more precipitation, so more rainfall, that is likely to increase the amount of mosquitoes or insects or ticks, or even displace those insects into areas that weren't really usually common. And it will also then increase the survival of the infectious agent themselves. So the warm and humid conditions, as I mentioned, are very, very good to promote or keep bacteria to survive, and similarly for viruses. So all of these factors then will lead to those impact, an increase in directly transmitted disease from human to human because of the human displacement. When we have extreme weather events, people congregate in the same area, and if people congregate in the same area, if one person is sick, it's much more likely to transmit to the others because they're in very close contact. So we see, for example, in shelters, or when we have huge human population displacements and people are living in, in conditions that actually probably not necessarily hygienic at the start because it's rapid. Then we see a huge amount of infectious disease. Also, those populations tend to be undernourished, so there's lots of other impacts that can lead to more vulnerability to infectious disease as well. Because there's a displacement in animals as well, we can see a more an increased likelihood of a direct contact between human and animals, and that leading to higher direct zoonoses. We also see an increase in vector-borne diseases through water, food, and insect-borne diseases. So I'm going to give you some examples here on that slide. And for example, we've seen higher number of cholera due to low and high rainfalls in Bangladesh. We've seen that mild temperature conditions are very favorable to ticks, and they modified the distribution of the Congo hemorrhagic fever, which is a disease that is passed on by ticks. And actually, we've seen outbreaks of this disease in Turkey when it was disease by its name. Congo is an African country. It was seen in the subcontinent and not in Europe. So we've seen a connection of that because there's been such mild temperatures and the spring. We have actually seen a greater number of Salmonella and Campylobacter in people, and increased about 30% in Europe. So that's a huge increase over the last 30 years, and food poisoning is really increasing there. We also have seen an abnormal occurrences of SARS, which is a respiratory disease. and they broke out in New Mexico and Colorado and Utah and Arizona. And it was found that it was spread by the deer mouse, and that was a result of a increase of rodents, and that was from a drought. So a drought then led to a lot more rodents, and then the rodents brought the virus with them. So you can see how animal displacement can really then increase our contact with those sort of diseases as well. In Sri Lanka, we have seen drought caused by a river. So a river shifted their course, and then we had river water accumulation. That led to a lot of breeding sites for local mosquitoes and led to an increase incidence of malaria. And we also have seen the worldwide increase of hospital admissions due to skin injuries from marine or aquatic organisms. And these means that they have extended their habitat due to favorable warm water environment, and that could be from jellyfish, or also there are sea parasites, and people have an allergic reaction to those sea parasites, and that's a form of inflammation of the skin, really, dermatitis. So we've seen those in areas that we would normally not see. So these are just a few examples. There are many, many more. Some scientists really argues that all that communicable diseases have been really on the rise in the last 30 years, and one of the explanation is climate change. Of course, we have to put that in context. There's also a lot more, the food trade is global. We also have global travel. So there are other characteristics there. And global travel clearly was such a key factor at the start of the pandemic as well. And that's why the virus spread so fast. I think we have to put all of what I've just mentioned in context. And we have to understand that yes, we have to understand the transmission patterns, the vectors, and how climate change can increase the likelihood of communicable diseases, but not all countries are going to be affected in the same way, because these can be mitigated by the social and economic infrastructures of different countries. So the degree of the effect of those infectious diseases on the population really depends on the level of social and economic infrastructures. For example, in countries where the water and food supply system and sewage systems are very well established, the effect of water and foodborne infections disease is expected to be less affected. We have had a number of flood, and actually that's not it goes back quite some years, but we did some studies of flood and flood water. Once we have a flood, then you can think that the sewage system is get flooded, and if the sewage system gets flooded, then we end up with fecal matter floating in the flood water. And yeah, we've done some tests on flood water, and it is highly contaminated with fecal bacteria. So that bacteria that are likely to cause diarrheal type diseases. And you can see here there's cryptosporosis, hepatitis, typhoid fever, cholera, all sorts of different germs in there can be found in flood water. But usually with our infrastructures, the waters are controlled quite quickly, and people are not in contact with that flood water for very long. They're usually, moved to a shelter. So you can see that in countries where maybe they don't have this, the infrastructures in which there's an immediate response to the flood, and that people are, basically just trying to help themselves, they're going to be in the water for quite some time and catching some diseases. So I think it's quite clear here. This is just to introduce the fact that, if we have good intervention, simple intervention, such effective hand washing can limit the transmissions of these infectious diseases and limit the burden of these infectious diseases on people. So just a few slides here on how do hands transmit and infectious agents. Many illness start with hands becoming contaminated with the disease. So we either sneeze or touch something that somebody sneezed on, and when we touch that, we touch our faces. It's really easy for us to automatically touch our faces, either our mouth or eyes, any kind of yeah, or noses, and that will then introduce the germ or the infectious agent to our bodies. Can happen after using the toilet, contact with a child's nappy, coughing, sneezing, touching other people's hands, touching surfaces, many different ways that can happen. A single gram of human feces can contain 10 million viruses and 1 million bacteria. And infant feces are particularly pathogenic. Infant feces, infants don't have a good immune system, so basically they don't attenuate the virus or the viral load, and yeah, it can be very pathogenic. When hands are contaminated with a disease-causing bacteria and virus, these pathogens enter the body, or they can be passed from person to person. And you can see that, you know, in those advertising for hand gel and things, that, you know, you can see the bacteria on somebody's hand and they're touching the baby's bowl, and then the baby's eating the food from the bowl, and then that's how it gets from one to the other. So you can see that there's a real clear pathways there. Our hands is our primary contact between us and the rest of the world. So we touch our faces, our mouth very regularly in the amount of an hour. But we also touch so much and so many surfaces, so that happens quite a lot. So regular hand wash is really necessary. Hands touch hundreds of surfaces, which contain many infectious agents. Germs can survive for up to 3 hours on our hands, so they can survive for long periods on our hands. Our hands are good, you know, they're warm. There's usually a bit of moisture. It's not usually really dry, so it's a good area for bacteria to be. We evaluate between 2 and 10 million bacteria on our hands. The number of germs on your fingertips double after we use the toilets. More importantly, our hand, sorry, just, where is it? When we don't wash our hands, we transfer germ to our food and drinks. Our hands spreads 1,000 times more germs when they are damp than when they are dry. So that's really an area that I want to put a lot of emphasis, because you see in the demonstration that I'm demonstrating a bad hand washing and technique, and that really having damp hands is a really a bad or very common area for us to actually transmit germs rather than not. One germ can multiply a lot, maybe 8 million germs a day. There's about 80% of illness-causing germs are spread by our hands. So 80% of the disease, the communicable diseases, are spread with our hands. So COVID, for example, we focused a lot because it's a respiratory ill health, focused a lot on the viral load and breathing and air, but it's really, hand is really important. Hand washing is still really important. An interesting fact as well, when we flush the toilet, the germ can spray. So there's this spray. So you think, oh, well, I didn't touch anything, but it's still, when you flush, it sprays, and therefore your hands can become contaminated. And that's an important thing to remember as well. You know, we put especially women, when we go to the toilet, we put our handbags maybe on the floor, where else to put them, and that gets really contaminated. The handbag is contaminated, then we touch the handbag, our hands become contaminated, and so on. You can see how that pattern really picks up that transmission chain, really. And purses and bags are very contaminated, and phones, we've done studies as well. Our phones are really filthy. Also, keyboards are really dirty. We looked at swabs between keyboards and toilet seats, and our keyboards are more contaminated than toilet seats. So we've done quite a bit of work on that too. So hand hygiene is the first line of defense against many diseases. I've put here COVID-19, but it is really vital to preventing the spread of many diseases, and will decrease the burden of those type of infectious diseases on global health. Rigorous hand hygiene is really crucial to the transmission, to reducing the transmission of the outbreak. It helps prevent the spreads of many different types of disease: cholera, Ebola, respiratory disease, colds and flus, and diarrheal disease. So it's really important. Not all disease are transmitted. For example, parasite type disease are not transmitted by our hands, but bacteria and viruses and fungus can all be transmitted with our hands. Simple hand hygiene has been proven to reduce about up to between 30 and 48% of all diarrheal type diseases, 23% of respiratory diseases, that's pneumonia, cold, flu, COVID-19, SARS, all of those, they are spread by our hands, not only by what we breathe. And 50% of pneumonia can be reduced by just effective hand hygiene as well. This makes hand hygiene one of the most cost-effective public health interventions. All you need is warm water, soap, and something to dry your hands. Those are the three key criteria in washing your hands. And we'll see that in the demonstration. So effective hand hygiene, I don't want to go over that too much. I think we have a lot of focus sometimes in, and I've put that video here, that poster here about the how the medical community will wash their hands, all these interlocking the fingers, making sure you're getting everything, the knuckles, all that. But when you're washing your hands yourself, you don't have to do necessarily all these different movements. It's really important that you use warm water, that you use soap, and that you're going to do it for sufficient time, and 20 seconds is the time. The fourth key element is drying, and this is what we have seen a lot of people don't do in when using public toilets. There are reasons for that, but drying is a really key essential part. If you don't dry your hands, even there could be a little bit of bacteria left on your hands, and those will grow exponentially really quickly on a damp hand. So it's really important. 20 seconds. Why 20 seconds? Because 20 seconds ensures that you're going to do it sufficiently well that you're going to get all of the areas there. So 20 seconds is important. We often underestimate what 20 seconds is. We recommend kids to sing the happy birthday song. There's also a Peppa, I don't know how I know these things, but there's a Peppa Pig song that wash your hands that takes about 20 seconds as well to do. So those sort of things for children. For an adult, is harder for us to sing the happy birthday song every time we're going to wash our hands. But just we really need to be conscious of 20 seconds. I wanted to address slightly hand sanitizers, because sometimes people will say, well, I don't really need to wash my hands so thoroughly because I'm using hand sanitizer. Washing hands with soap and water is the best way to remove all type of germs and also chemicals. So we can have harmful chemicals on our hands, and hand sanitizers won't neutralize those. Hand sanitizer are not effective against all of the infectious agents. They are very effective against COVID-19. COVID-19 is a weak virus. This COVID-19 can be easily neutralized if we wash our hands, if we have it's not a very strong, it doesn't have a very strong protective cell around it, so it's easily. But there are other things like norovirus, which actually makes quite a lot of people unwell with diarrheal type disease. Cryptosporidium, Clostridium difficile, all of these are not, Clostridium difficile being one of those MRSA, so those big superbugs that we see in hospitals. They're not affected by hand sanitizer, so washing your hands is still really primordial. Sanitizer are not effective against harmful chemicals. They're not suitable, so if your hands are soiled, so if your hands are dirty, physically dirty, you need to just wash them. And if soap and water are not available, then next best thing is alcohol-based sanitizer, and I know that this has been in the public realm for quite some time with COVID-19, it has to have at least 60% alcohol in there for it to be any kind of efficient. So and there you go. So I have a short demonstration of what we can see a good hand washing protocol and maybe a not so good protocol. In this work, in this demonstration, I'll show you. I just wanted to mention that an ATP reader is what otherwise known by a luminometer, and it measures the amount of light generated um, by the mass, and that is information gives us the level of contamination in really just seconds. So I'm going to be using an ATP reader or luminometer, and you'll see that in the demonstration. And the unit that is used is RLU, which is called relative light units, and it detects the presence of contamination. That's really all there is to it. There's more complex science behind that, but I'll not go into that today. So I'll show you the video here quickly. I might skip forward a bit in bits.
Short demonstration of effective hand washing and also some of the not as effective hand washing. To do this, I'm going to use an ATP reader. So it's a machine really that uses a swab, and I'll demonstrate that I'm using the swabs on my hand. And that swab will collect organic matter, which is indicative of germs on my hands. And then I pop in the machine, and the machine will tell me the level of contamination. So it's very straightforward, and it's very quick. The machine takes 10 seconds to take a reading, and that will be very helpful in demonstrating to you how effective hand washing can decrease the amount of germs on my hands. So I'm going to take now my swab and show you. I have not washed my hands. They're just the way I've started the filming. And I'm going to use this swab. Anybody that has done a COVID test would be now quite familiar with swabbing. So it's just a wee cotton bud, you can see there. And I'm going to use it on my hand, the surface of my hand, different fingers. Okay. Also, another area that's always quite contaminated is underneath the ring, because it's your rings, because it's quite hard to reach whenever you're washing your hands. So they could be a good indicator as well. So I'm going to do there, and the top of my hands as well. So and the fingers. Okay. Another area which is also prone to contamination is underneath the fingernails. So I can just do a quick swab there. Just making sure I swabbed all the different areas here. Then I place the swab back in its wee container, and I have a little solution here that I pop. Okay, so I pop this, the solution goes down, make sure that I twirl it a wee bit so the liquid gets all of the material that has been collected on the cotton bud. Okay. I place this in the machine and run the tests. You will see here that it takes about 10 seconds to run the test, and it will tell me the level of contamination that was on my hands at this stage.
The test hadn't started. That was my mistake here.
You'll hear some clicking. 1, 2, and there you go. So this tells me that my reading has failed, so my hands are highly contaminated, and actually the contamination is 1,298. So 1,300 RLU, that's the unit in which we are measuring that contamination there. So really for hand hygiene, it depends what field you're in. So obviously for people in nurses or people that are going to go into theatre and personal surgery, you would want a really, really low count, maybe below 60. In the food industry, they've put the limit a little bit higher, maybe around 200, but we are well above here with 1,298. So that's done. So I'm now going to perform effective hand washing just to show you how much I can decrease the contamination on my hands with effective hand washing. Remember, we have to use warm water. It's important. The heat of the water will help lather up, and it will also help destroy some of the germs that are on my hands. So make sure that the water is hot. I'm going to use liquid soap here, but any type of soap would do. I also have solid soap here. Um, what's really important when we lather up is the time. So we're going to count at 20 seconds. You can sing a song, or you can just look at the time. I'll not use you to sing a song. My singing is quite terrible, so I'll just talk away. Make sure that I get all the areas, the top of my hand, in between my fingers, and just below my ring. Again, both of them. I have a ring on both hands. It's important to just lather up properly. I know that um, in the medical field they have specific hand movement that they perform. Here, I made a mess with all the paper towels here. Okay. It's really important that we dry our hands thoroughly, because if we leave moisture on our hands, then germs can continue to grow. Even if there's a low count, then in a couple hours, then these bacteria that loves moisture can grow very, very quickly. So that's why I need to dry my hands really, really well. So that I've done that now. So I'm going to do the swabbing again to demonstrate, to see what is the bacterial count. So again, palm of my hands, fingers, top of my hands. Let's try the fingernails too, and around my wedding band. Again, my other
Okay.
hand.
I'm just going to go a bit further here, just to the reading there. So you know how I do the swabbing, so there's no point you watching it again. So I'm just going a bit further there.
Wait 10 seconds.
So that's the test after I wash my hands.
And at this stage, it still says that it's a fail, because my it's above the critical limit of 60 RLU. But the result is 143. So before I washed my hands, I had 1,300 RLU, and now I've decreased that loads tenfold with 143. So you can see that's very, very effective. Actually, this limit is below the food safety or the food standard limits, which is of 200. So I am well within a good, well-washed hand.
I mean, clearly for everyday use, that count would be absolutely acceptable. I mean, it is not, your hand will always have some amount of organic matter on it, so that's a very, very good reading.
It wouldn't be necessarily suitable to clean off under the feeling disease to be transmitted to humans. A poor hand washing technique does not reduce the bacterial load. So my hands are dirty.
So the second part is here. I'm going to demonstrate how a poor technique will reduce how it reduce or not the bacterial load. So I'm doing swabbing before again.
And I'm gonna have another wee swab just to show you before. Thing that we've seen in our research, call it the splash and dash.
So yeah, the technique I'm demonstrating here is what we call a splash and dash, which is a very common thing that we've seen in our work. People then just go out of the toilet and then run their hands under the water. They apply sometimes a bit of soap, but not very much, and not thoroughly, and not for long enough. They just put their hands under the water and then walk away from the toilet. So that's really what I'm going to demonstrate here.
Just put their hands under the water for.
So the reading beforehand, So in between the two filming, I had my hands were dirty again, so that's why the reading will be up.
Right. Again, we should be hearing the wee.
There's a wee text there.
She's working. Okay. Okay. So at this stage, my hands are above the threshold of 200. They're at 400 RLU. Let's see if
So
Splash
my
and Dash
hands
is gonna really.
At this stage, my hands are not very contaminated, but they're still above the limits, 400. That's because I did this filming after the first filming, so I had already washed my hands a bit. So that's why my hands were not terribly dirty. I mean, they weren't, in the thousands, which would be after a couple hours, after your last hand washing. But 400 is still above limits. So I demonstrated splash and dash.
The toilet itself, but the cubicle is bacteria or germs.
Ooh. I don't know why it jumped here. Sorry.
Run the test.
There you go. Sorry about that.
10 seconds for the machine to give me the reading. And it's a fail. And
this is after I've done the splash and dash. I didn't show you, but this is after the splash and dash, and that's the reading after then that poor hand hygiene.
1,774. The contamination is much worse than beforehand. Beforehand was 400, and doing the splash and dash actually makes my hands more contaminated. The reason for that is the water. So because I put the water on, it then would have spread maybe the bacterial that was maybe in one area of my hand to an other area.
Typically, it would have probably gone into my fingernails and under my rings, and there's more contamination there. And then the water would have spread that load onto the rest of my hand. So that splash and dash really demonstrate that from a hand that wasn't so contaminated before, it becomes really contaminated after. So really, really poor technique. So I'll not bore you much longer from that demonstration. I hope that was helpful in some ways to demonstrate that we can use a good quick tool to measure the contamination on hand, and also to demonstrate to you that really if we use hand washing effectively, we can decrease the amount of infectious agents on our hands. But if we don't, then we actually potentially increase it rather than decrease it. So in the work that we've done, we've carried out observations on hand hygiene. We put thermal cameras so we couldn't actually see who was using the bathroom or whatever, and also it was only pointing at the hand washing basin. But we were just looking at if people were, how often people wash their hands and so on. So we got some really good figures. The hand hygiene is well known to be quite poor worldwide. The World Health Organization argues about less than 40% people wash their hands appropriately. In our study, we found a better rates than that. We've seen actually that 93% of people did go to the in front of the sink to wash their hands. So 93% of people had that step. However, we've only seen 17% of people doing it appropriately, which means that we've seen a lot of people doing splash and dash, a lot of people not drying their hands, and a lot of people not washing for 20 seconds or not drying sufficiently. So these were really, really key. Some people didn't use the soap either. I think maybe sometimes people are reluctant to touch the soap dispensers. There could be many, many, many different reasons. But the key here is that, yes, people take that first step, the first step to go to the sink to prepare for hand washing, then they end up not doing it effectively. And you could see in the demonstration that I have done before that actually that may lead to increased contamination rather than decreased contamination, which is what you want from washing your hands. So I just have this wee photo to say that there are many complex reasons why people might not wash their hands, and the lack of adequate facilities and soap and dryer is really a barrier. I have experienced it myself. You go to a public toilet and it looks grimy and dirty, and you just don't want to be there. You don't want to be there for any length of time. You think, oh, if I go to the sink, it'll get worse. It'll be worse than not actually washing my hands. So that is a big barrier. We need to ensure that everybody has access to a sink, clean sink that has um, adequate facilities. There are other reasons, of course, lack of education and awareness that hand washing is so key and plays such a big role in the reduction of epidemics or the prevention of epidemics. We also seen that there's a hand washing culture and a social norm. So if we don't enforce that in our families, in within our friends, when we go out with our friends, or if we go to the and use public toilets and see other people that don't regularly wash our hands, then it doesn't push us to wash our hands. So in cultures where washing your hand isn't very embedded, then we see people less likely to wash their hands. We also have two other things that are called, one is called optimism bias, when people just feel, oh, well, I never get sick. It won't happen to me. COVID-19 won't happen to me. That's the optimism. I don't need to wash my. It doesn't really. I'm not. I'm optimistic. I'll take my chances. The other characteristics that we've seen in people that determine that a person might not wash their hands is some people are not squeamish. They don't mind a bit of grime. They don't mind a bit of bacteria. They think bacteria are good for you. So that will be the lack of squeamishness. Tend to be then people that won't comply with the hand washing. So those are two characteristics. So just to finish on, what can we do about that? And that's actually a big question that I've been contemplating for quite some time. So we've done all this work over the last maybe 8 years now, looking at different hand washing, different techniques, whether or not people do hand washing. What can we do to try to make people wash their hands more often and more effectively? Really effectively is the thing. You would have seen campaigns, we've all seen the posters, but they don't really actually get you to wash your hands more effectively. So what can we do? Well, it's such complex reasons for why people don't wash their hands effectively that we need a mix of interventions. So obviously education is key, and that's really well embedded in the children's curriculum, especially younger children and preschool and school children. So we put a lot of emphasis in drilling hand washing as a habit and a habit for life. But we actually found in our work, we found that children and young adults were quite good at washing their hands. It's later on that that we are not so good. So starting maybe university time, and as adults, we don't wash our hands as effectively as we do. So maybe some kind of we get used to it, or we're rule break. We break the rule once, and then we continue to break that rule, and we don't even do it consciously. I think sometimes a change in social norm, so really getting people to understand that is so important. And I think for a long period of time, we took epidemics or infectious disease, really they weren't a big thing. We didn't think, oh well, we'll take antibiotics, or we'll just have medical intervention. I think COVID-19 really changed that and showed us how vulnerable we were to really a simple, small, simple organism, infectious organism, because COVID-19 is not a really complex or difficult one to control, really. And yeah, it really brought it home to us how vulnerable we are as population, and maybe refocused our idea on hand washing. So increasing the social pressure as well. So putting pressure on people that are rule breaker, that don't wash their hands, and make them feel that they really need to fit in with us. So social pressure was really well applied for trying to get people to stop smoking. So smoking really became from a really cool thing to do to really probably now not well regarded thing to do. You know, we've ostracized people that smoke. So I think we can do something similar in terms of public health intervention to change that vision of hand washing. And also we need to hype that intrinsic self-protection. You're doing it for you. You're doing it to protect yourself from being sick. So people that are you know, that lack that squeamishness, or people that have this optimism, you know, that may be a way of addressing that issue. So it was a very quick session. It was probably a bit longer than I would have liked. I wanted to stay under the 30 minutes mark, but when you start talking, then it unravels a bit. But I do hope it was very informative for you, and I'm very happy to answer any question or queries that any of you may have. I can see that maybe at this stage no questions, but you can pop wee questions in the Q&A button. I hope. Thank you so much for joining today.